Hi, good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining me. I think that when I asked this question, which drug was suppressed, quite a number of people could have come up with ideas like a drug that rhymes with pectin, or something that was used in Africa at population level for malaria. You'll know what I'm talking about. Some people may think that I'm talking about vitamin that could have benefited COVID 19 patients. All of these things have benefit, but none of them were absolutely critical. Now, I just had the discussion recently with Dr. Rapiti from South Africa, and his strategy with regards to managing patients with COVID 19 included all these things. But similar to Dr. Shetty, there was something that everybody who was serious about saving lives used. And it's not just them, also the FLCCC used it as well. So I can show you this image. This is from the presentation. And the critical thing that I want to highlight is a specific drug here, this one, prednisone. And look at the dose. Now, I'm going to take you through a few steps with regards to this, but this is what I'm talking about when I talk about serious disease and trying to prevent death. If you are not using that, you will have some benefit for people who are moderate COVID, but for the more severe patients, if you don't have that in your toolbox, it's not going to work. So, this is what I'm going to take you through as to why I think this was such an important drug and why I'm saying that it was suppressed. Because everybody says, well, we know about it. Well, follow along and you'll understand what I mean. Before I start, as usual, coming up is the next phase of our pre launch COVID 19 Advanced 360 course. And what we want you to do is that we've done part one, we've done part two. All of these are modules that we're putting together. You'll never come across anything as comprehensive as this. We are now down to we're over 30 modules now. And we are at this bit where we're coming to vaccines. And this is where I'm going to be highlighting the benefits and the risks with regards to what we have done. And so, if you want to join for the recording, the link is in the description below. You can join. There are some free tickets, donation tickets. They're a limited number. And usually, those are the people who can ask questions when we're doing it live. So, let's get back to this question. Why in the world would I say that steroids were suppressed? They were probably the most talked about drug in the context of the pandemic. So, what is it that I am referring to? You have to follow along here. I did this presentation in July of 2022, and it got a huge amount of response because I think people understood what I was talking about. And I described it as a treatment conspiracy. And I'll show you what I mean and what were the outcomes from that kind of argument. So, we had here one of the most important breakthroughs in terms of COVID 19. And this was done by the recovery trial. And this was here published the 17th of June in 2020. Dexamethasone. What is the breakthrough treatment for COVID 19? Now, I want to tell you that this is probably one of the best bits of research approach that had happened in the pandemic. It's going to make a movie, I'm sure, one day because the guys were just on a bus and they said, you know what, we've got to do something. We know how to do research. Why don't we test a number of drugs? And they tested, I think, 5 at the beginning. One of them was dexamethasone. It's a steroid. And lo and behold, it worked. That was great, wasn't it? Well, you have to think about it in a little bit more detail. So I'm just going to show you a little bit more information and I'll then explain to you why this is so important. So steroids or corticosteroids they are anti-inflammatory medications. We use them in a whole range of conditions. People who have asthma will know what we're talking about. People with COPD, people with autoimmune diseases. We use it across a whole variety of conditions in medicine. Now, it's not without risk, and so we use it only when we have to, but it is an exceptionally important drug in our armory. And as I said, this was the recovery trial. When they did the recovery trial, they found that when they looked at the results afterwards, they may have had a impact, reducing deaths by up to a third across the world. This came through from Oxford. So literally within days, the whole world was using dexamethasone, low-cost steroid treatment, reducing the deaths of hospitalized COVID-19 patients with severe respiratory complications by up to a third. It was shown to improve survival in COVID-19, inexpensive, on the shelf, and can be used immediately to save lives worldwide. This was huge. I'm telling you, at the time, everybody knew, wow, we've got something that can work. And when they looked at the anticipated outcomes, they think that across the world, they may have saved 1 million lives globally by March 2021 by just using dexamethasone. Well, of course, they stopped when the vaccines were rolled out. Nobody was then as worried about this, but this was huge. As I said, you cannot underestimate how significant that was. And one interesting thing about the problem with medicine is that we follow advice from those people that we consider to be the experts. Because I'll tell you this much, that FLCCC was using steroids even before that. Actually, because of the work that FLCCC was doing, myself and another professor had sent a letter to Downing Street in the UK to saying, listen, look at this work. These guys are getting impressive results. Why are we not considering steroids? And you have to remember that from my point of view, I was looking at this already as an autoimmune disease. And there is no more valuable drug than steroids in managing autoimmunity. So the big question, and this is the one that I can ask anybody to explain this. If you know a medic or anybody in the health sector who uses these drugs, here is the question. We worked out in June 2020 that dexamethasone 6 milligrams was going to make a significant difference to the pandemic. The question is, why didn't they ask the next step, which is dosing and formulation? So if 6 milligrams works, could a lower dose work or could a higher dose work? That's the next question. Because if you are seeing that kind of impact, you got to wonder, well, could we even get a better outcome? That's where that question of suppression comes in. And now, this one here, I can't explain clinically why the whole medical community didn't ask this question. I genuinely don't understand. And as I said, I am happy if somebody in the medical community can challenge this and say, no, no, no. 6 milligrams was fine. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter the weight of the patient. It doesn't matter the size of the patient. 6 milligrams will work every time. How would you know if you didn't look? So follow along here. This is important education. When we look at steroids, the drug or the dose that we used was 6 milligrams of dexamethasone. Now, dexamethasone can be used in a wide range of conditions, but it's not the preferred steroid because it tends to have a few more side effects. We clinically like to use it for brain tumors or when there is brain edema because it crosses the blood-brain barrier. But the more standard drugs, prednisone or prednisolone, the equivalent to 6 milligrams of dexamethasone is 40 milligrams of prednisone. And for those people who are asthmatic or even COPD, you will know that this is around the kind of dose we give you in short courses. Hydrocortisone, not as commonly used in terms of respiratory stuff, but it's about 160 milligrams. That's the equivalent to 6 milligrams of dexamethasone. And then you have methylprednisolone. The equivalent to dexamethasone is about 32 milligrams. And you can use these drugs interchangeably because if somebody is, for whatever reason, allergic to dexamethasone, you just change them to the equivalent dose of prednisolone, of hydrocortisone, of methylprednisolone. It doesn't matter because they will all have a similar kind of effect. Now, when it comes to dosing, for people who don't understand, they would think, well, for everything we used, we only used about 40 milligrams of steroids. Why would you use more than that? Again, follow along. It depends on what you're treating. So, here are some examples of what we would tend to use. So, patients with lupus, we may probably use about 20 milligrams, and certainly that for maintenance dose. COPD, as I said, is around 40 milligrams, or asthma. COPD could be 30 milligrams, depending on the recommendations. Polymyalgia rheumatica, again, this one is very responsive to steroids, and it's usually about 50 to 60 milligrams. Um, if, however, you're talking about lung vasculitis, and so for in case there are some medics here, what we're talking about is a patient who has a SLE or rheumatoid arthritis, and they have a significant cytokine response with lung inflammation for which they need oxygen and intensive care. The dose you are going to be using is about 1,250 milligrams. You're talking huge doses in order to suppress that kind of response. Now, think about this. When we're talking about severe COVID 19, an acute, sudden onset, severe respiratory distress, for which people may need to be on intensive care to get oxygen and so on, and we now know that it was inflammation in the arteries going into the alveoli that caused the microclots, what we call perivascular inflammation. That is presenting like a lung vasculitis. You need big doses of steroids. That's one of the things that actually, when we think about it, a lot of people were afraid of doing. But it reminded me about this. This is why I'm talking about it. After talking to Dr. Rapity, again, look carefully at what he was using. And you can see it here. We're talking about 50 milligrams twice a day is what he was doing. Again, Dr. Shetty was using about 80 milligrams, 80 to over 100 milligrams daily in order to settle down the cytokine storm. This is what similarly FLCCC was, and they were getting remarkable results. Remember, none of these guys' patients were dying. You can't do it without having good doses of steroids. So, meaning that if you are using some of the other drugs, you would still have benefit, but you're likely to still have a number of patients who deteriorate, depending on when you catch them. But with steroids, this is the big boy when it comes to suppressing a cytokine storm. You definitely need big doses of steroids. As I said, how is it that this wasn't done? And this is just some information here to show you the effects of steroids as the dose goes up, the equivalent of prednisolone per day here. Going from low dose, it affects mainly in the nucleus of the cell. But as you go beyond 100 milligrams, up to 200, 500 milligrams, you are starting to have other effects outside of the just the nucleus to suppress the immune system. So, this is a critical drug that we use every single day in some part of medicine, whether it's not that somebody is coming with an allergic response, anaphylaxis, whatever it is, steroids are a critical part of medicine. So, the question was, why didn't they go on? Why didn't immediately? You have to remember, it was June 2020. You see 6 milligrams of dexamethasone works. I just don't understand. Why would you not ask the next obvious question? Did I get the dose right? Did I get the formulation right? So instead of testing dexamethasone, you test dexamethasone, lower dose and higher dose. You would test dexamethasone against other steroids, prednisone or hydrocortisone, suppose you get better benefit with it, why would you just stop with the dexamethasone? Now, my question was very simple. There are only three reasons you wouldn't do it. One, you didn't know. And so you just had no idea. You were wise enough and bright enough to figure out the study, but you didn't think about, well, maybe we should optimize the dose. I don't believe that. The other option is, therefore, that maybe they just couldn't be bothered. I mean, these are guys who were genuinely looking for answers. Why would they not be bothered? If they found some benefit, of course you want to know, could you even get better benefit? Or the big one, and this is where the conspiracy comes from. I have no evidence of this. I am just asking the question. Was it because if this drug was as good as Dr. Shetty had found and Dr. Rapity had found and FLCCC had found, where they were not getting deaths, would you need to have any other intervention to try and prevent deaths with COVID? Just think about that for a second, because in effect, emergency use authorization could only occur if you didn't have anything else that worked adequately. So suddenly, you can't have a treatment. And I genuinely have no logical answer as to why this was not done. And here's the point. Here's why I know they should have done it. Look again. So they recognized that they had to investigate whether higher doses of dexamethasone deliver greater benefit for patients with severe COVID-19. This was in December 2021. Remember, the original study was June 2020. This is 18 months later. They decide to talk about this. So there clearly it's not that they didn't know, but why delay it for 18 months? Who would benefit from that? If it's important, why wouldn't you want to know? Because you have to ask the question. So if lower dose steroids had an impact, imagine higher dose steroids. So if it saved 1 million lives globally at moderate to lower doses, imagine if they used big doses. Just like the outcomes with Dr. Shetty and Dr. Rapity and so on, they were getting remarkable outcomes. Just to remind you, it's sad. Dr. Shetty is being taken to court for saving so many people in a relatively poor part of South Africa who didn't have access to the hospital. He just came up with whatever he could, and he saved the lives of his patients. The critical part was steroids along with antihistamines. He knew this. Other people knew this. Why did it take so long? Now, I'm going to now tell you the other part of this, because you will have people saying, well, the reason is because it wouldn't have worked. And we now have evidence that it wouldn't have worked. Now, watch this carefully. Now, this is, as I said, for people who are thinking. So here is what happened. Higher dose steroids, corticosteroids, in patients admitted to hospital with COVID-19 who are hypoxic but not requiring ventilatory support. This is the recovery trial, a randomized controlled open label trial. It was published in April of 2023. Okay? Their conclusion in there, so they randomized it and so on. And in conclusion, they said, in patients hospitalized for COVID-19 with clinical hypoxia who required no oxygen or simple oxygen alone, higher dose corticosteroids significantly increased the risk of death compared with the usual care, including low dose corticosteroids. So in effect, they're saying it wouldn't have worked. So no problem. Let me tell you the reality. If high dose steroids don't work, low dose steroids don't work, because you can't have the benefit with low dose and the benefit with high dose not occurring because of how the drug works. So people would say, well, it could be that they had more complications related to it. Well, I'm sorry to tell you that when I looked carefully in the study, and it's here, I looked at it and I was looking for that. When you looked at metabolic complications, ketoacidosis less than 1%, and these are the two groups, higher dose versus usual care, no significant difference. Some people's blood sugar went up a little bit. There were a few other episodes of pneumonia in the higher dose group, which you would expect. It would not or should not significantly have affected the results where it didn't show benefit. It should have at least shown equivalent benefit with slight improvement if steroids work. So they're stuck. Either steroids work or they don't work. But higher dose steroids, based on the research because of the metabolic complications, it doesn't make sense that it didn't have an impact. So again, just because I asked questions, I then looked in a little bit more detail because if this study had been done very early on, they would have used a similar cohort of patients as they did with the original study. Now, I can't explain why certain things wouldn't have worked in other ways, but without a shadow of a doubt, there was a difference in the cohort. So when I looked carefully at the cohort, and I'll show you this here, and I looked carefully at the cohort here, this is the higher dose versus usual care. I'll show you the ages, 70, less than 70, 70 to 79, greater than 80, male versus female, 60 to 40%. You can see this follows the pattern of severe disease. Men are much more affected. But as you go down and we look at the sources of the countries that were involved, Ghana had a few patients, Indonesia had a few patients, UK had about 38% of the patients. But Nepal had 48% of the cohort. I mean, that struck me as very, very strange. And I don't know why they had so many. I don't know what was the reason that we had so many patients in this study coming out of Nepal. And you have to remember that the original study was only just done in the UK. Why didn't they just do it at the same time in the UK to get very clear observation as the comparison? As I say, I can't explain the reasons in the past why people decided to do what they did. All I'm saying is that when you understand that severe COVID 19, moderate to severe COVID 19 with microclotting and the viral pneumonia, this is effectively a lung vasculitis. It's autoimmune. The immune system is attacking the lung. You have to use immunosuppressants. You have to use adequate doses of steroids. If you don't use it, a percentage of your patients will not improve, and you have to use it immediately. If you have a patient who has severe disease and you wait even 2 days before starting the steroids, you have maybe missed the boat. That's the problem. And it's very sad because it's possible that people were gambling on the success of other things. And they realized that, listen, we were going to succeed. And maybe they genuinely thought that what they had would have worked because clearly they didn't understand the autoimmune pathology around severe COVID. If they did, they would have realized one, you definitely need to use steroids, and two, you need to be very, very careful about overstimulating the immune system. So that's the point that I think that I wanted to highlight. And it was just reminded to me because of the work that Dr. Rapity had said. Again, I just show you the image. You can look at the Substack. The link is should be below, and you'll be able to see his full presentation. But yes, this is one of the most important drugs, and the dosing needs to be right, needs to take into consideration the weight. And at the moment, it's not so relevant because we don't see that kind of presentation of disease anymore. This is now mostly a historical reference. And so, in the context of the history, that's going to be a big question. Why was the research not done immediately? And could that research have changed the whole trajectory of the pandemic. Have a great evening.